Some of the loudest breakdowns I've ever had looked like silence. Still, numb. But inside, screaming. And that's when I learned the absence of noise is not the absence of pain. It's often where God waits for us to finally listen. I remember sitting in my parked car in a grocery store lot one evening, the kind of night when the air feels too heavy and even your own skin feels like a burden. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but I hadn't moved for over an hour. The groceries were still waiting inside, but I was frozen. My hands were clenched around the steering wheel, not in anger, but in desperation, like if I let go, I'd fall apart right there in the parking lot. There wasn't any music playing, no podcast, no phone calls to drown it out, just stillness. And it was deafening. Not the peaceful kind people romanticize, the kind that sits on your chest and whispers all the things you've been trying not to feel. Grief from a loss I never fully processed. Shame from words I couldn't take back. Fear that maybe I had been pretending to be okay for too long. And the worst part? I couldn't pray. I didn't know how. I'd prayed 1,000 rehearsed prayers in my life, but in that moment, all I had was, I don't even know what I need. We live in a world that glorifies motion. You wake up and your worth is measured by what you do, who you impress, what you check off your list. We're addicted to productivity, as if being still makes us useless. But I've learned that sometimes doing nothing is the bravest thing we can do, because it's in the stillness that the real work begins, the internal work we keep postponing. Our nervous system is designed to flee from pain. When things get uncomfortable, we scroll, text, binge, shop, clean, perform. Anything to stay distracted. Because stillness feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like danger. But avoiding discomfort doesn't heal us. It buries us. That night in the car, I finally whispered something I hadn't said in a long time. God, if you're here, I need you. And that whisper cracked something open in me. Not because I heard a voice back, but because I finally made space to be honest. That's what stillness does. It makes space for truth to surface. Stillness isn't passive, it's sacred. It's not the absence of chaos. It's the courage to sit with it and say, I won't run this time. It's where prayer stops being a script and starts being a lifeline. And that moment, in the quiet darkness of my car, was the beginning of healing. Not because I solved anything, but because I showed up to the silence and I let it hold me. Sometimes the most powerful prayer is simply the willingness to be still long enough to feel what hurts, to name what's broken, and to believe that maybe, just maybe, God meets us not in our strength, but in our surrender. Stillness isn't the absence of movement. It's the presence of meaning. There was a night when I sat on the edge of my bed, shoulders slumped, hands limp in my lap, and I couldn't form a single prayer. I had prayed every way I knew how before, loudly, desperately, repeatedly, but this time, I was too tired. Not sleepy tired, soul tired. The kind of exhaustion where your spirit feels frayed and your heart is too bruised to form words. There were things I needed, clarity, peace, maybe even a miracle, but I couldn't ask. It felt like my voice had been buried under the weight of disappointment, like every prayer I'd ever offered had gone unanswered, echoing into a God who felt distant or indifferent. So I didn't pray that night. I just sat, completely still, head bowed, silent. I didn't say anything, and still I prayed. Because sometimes the most profound prayers are the ones without words, the ones where your tears become your language and your breath becomes your offering. That night, I didn't speak, but everything inside me cried out, God, I'm here. Please be here too. We think prayer has to sound polished. We're taught to come to God with clean hands, structured requests, memorized verses. But real prayer, the kind that changes you, it's often ugly, messy, incomplete. It's raw presence, and it doesn't require perfection, it requires honesty. In trauma psychology, there's this idea called felt safety, the ability to feel emotionally secure even when you don't fully understand your surroundings. For people with chronic stress or deep wounds, this sense of safety is often absent. And so silence can feel like abandonment, it can trigger fear. But when silence is combined with connection, even the hope of divine connection, it begins to soothe the parts of us that were always bracing for pain. That's what prayer did that night. It didn't fix me, but it held me. It wrapped around me like a quiet assurance, as if God wasn't asking me to perform, but simply to be. And that was the shift I didn't know I needed. Not answers, but presence. We don't talk about this enough, about how we can feel ashamed when we don't have the energy to pray, about how we sometimes avoid stillness because we're afraid of what might rise up in the silence. But stillness, when welcomed with intention, becomes a sacred space. It becomes the bridge between collapse and courage. When I finally stood up that night, nothing about my situation had changed, but I had. Something subtle had softened in me. Something lonely had been acknowledged. That moment of silent surrender became one of the most intimate spiritual experiences of my life. Not because I spoke, but because I allowed myself to not speak and still be seen. The power of prayer isn't in how loud we speak. It's in how deeply we surrender. There was a season of my life where I couldn't stop moving. From the outside, I looked productive, always working, always saying yes, always helping others. But underneath the hustle was a very different truth. I was terrified of stopping, because if I stopped, I knew the silence would expose something I didn't want to face. I was afraid of what I might hear in the stillness, afraid that I'd discover I was exhausted from performing, not just for the world, but for God, that my identity was built on approval, not truth, that somewhere along the line, I'd confused being needed with being loved. So I kept running. I kept filling my calendar. I kept praying the way I thought I was supposed to, eloquently, strategically, as if God were a CEO I had to impress with my reports. But the prayers felt thin, hollow, and the silence I kept avoiding, it started creeping in anyway. Then one day, in the middle of a conversation with a close friend, I heard myself say something I hadn't planned to say. I don't think I believe the things I'm pretending to believe. And there it was, the truth I had been running from. That moment shattered me, but it also saved me. When I finally stopped long enough to be honest, I realized that stillness wasn't my enemy. The stillness saved my life. When I finally stopped long enough to be honest, I realized that stillness wasn't my enemy. The stillness wasn't my enemy. The stillness wasn't my enemy. It was the only space where the lies I'd built my life around could start to unravel. Lies like, if you slow down, you'll fall behind. If people knew the real you, they'd walk away. If God is silent, it must be your fault. Stillness exposed those lies for what they were: coping mechanisms, defense strategies, old wounds masquerading as truths. In psychology, we call these internal narratives core beliefs. Core beliefs, they are formed early, shaped by trauma, reinforced by culture, and lived out as gospel, even when they no longer serve us. The mind loves predictability, even if the story it clings to is harmful. That's why we avoid silence, because silence invites us to question the story. But the beautiful and painful thing about stillness is that it holds a mirror to your soul. It shows you where you're wearing masks. It shows you where you've built scaffolding around your pain and called it strength. It invites you, gently but firmly, to lay down the performance and ask, what's actually true? Prayer in the midst of stillness becomes less about getting answers and more about meeting yourself with compassion. It becomes the moment when your soul whispers, you don't have to do this anymore. You don't have to keep proving you're worthy. Stillness isn't empty, it's clarifying. And when paired with prayer, it becomes the sacred undoing of every lie that told you love had to be earned. That season broke me open, and it wasn't glamorous. I cried a lot. I journaled things I didn't want to admit. I sat in the quiet and asked questions I didn't have answers to. But piece by piece, the noise fell away. And in its place, I found something quieter, truer. There was a time, not too long ago, when I prayed with everything I had in me, and all I got back was silence. I had done everything I knew to do. I had poured my heart out. I had laid all my hopes and fears on the table. I had fasted, cried, waited, and still, nothing. No confirmation, no direction, no peace. Just silence. At first, I thought I had done something wrong. I replayed every decision, every word, wondering if I had misstepped, wondering if I had disappointed God. I carried the silence like a punishment. And the more silent it got, the more abandoned I felt. Have you ever prayed so hard that your chest ached and then sat in a room that felt colder afterward? That kind of quiet is brutal. Not because it's peaceful, but because it feels empty. Like you showed up for a meeting with God and He forgot. I remember one night when the silence was so loud it made me angry. I walked out onto my porch, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket, and looked up at the sky. And I just shouted into the night, "Say something, anything. I'm here. Where are you?" But the stars didn't blink. The sky didn't part. There was no thunder. No verse floated down from heaven. Just air. Just stillness. And it was in that moment, somewhere between heartbreak and surrender, that I realized something I'd never understood before. Sometimes God's silence isn't absence. It's presence in disguise. It took me a long time to accept that. I wanted answers, not mystery. I wanted direction, not delay. But the more I sat with the silence, the more I realized it was forming me. It was deepening my roots in a way noise never could. There's a concept in psychology and attachment theory called secure presence. It's the idea that you don't have to speak or perform to feel close to someone. Just being with them, just knowing they're near, can bring comfort. That's what God's silence became for me, a secure presence, not loud, not flashy, but steady, faithful. Sometimes we confuse God's silence with His absence because we associate love with constant reassurance. But maybe mature love, divine love, doesn't need to shout. Maybe it trusts us enough to let us wrestle, to let us grow, to let us sit in uncertainty without giving up. Stillness is where trust is born. Not trust that everything will work out exactly how we want, but trust that even in the silence, we are not forgotten. That even in the unknown, we are being held. I look back on that night now, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Because that silence shaped me more than any answered prayer ever could. It taught me how to stay, how to listen without demanding, how to believe even when I couldn't feel. And I think that's what faith really is. Not certainty, not formulas, but intimacy in the dark. When heaven is quiet, it's not because you've been forgotten. It's because you're being held. We live in a world that never stops talking, never stops moving. Noise has become our comfort, our culture, and if we're being honest, our crutch. Every quiet moment is instantly filled. A podcast during the morning routine, music while we drive, background TV while we clean, endless scrolling while we wait. Silence isn't just rare, it's something we fear. I didn't realize how addicted I was to noise until I went on a retreat. One of those silent kinds. No phones, no music, no distractions. Just you, your thoughts, and God. By the second day, I was unraveling. Not because something bad had happened, but because without the constant sound of other voices, I started to hear my own. And honestly, I didn't like what came up. Insecurity, envy, anger, old wounds I thought I had moved on from. I remember writing in my journal, I thought I was healed, but maybe I was just distracted. Stillness doesn't just reveal the beauty in us, it reveals the ache. It shows us the parts we've been covering up with productivity and pretending. It shows us the parts we've been covering up with productivity and pretending. It shows us the parts we've been covering up with productivity and pretending. It shows us the parts we've been covering up with productivity and pretending. It invites us to sit at the table with our pain and say, okay, I see you now. And that's where prayer begins, not in the curated, filtered self we present to the world, but in the raw, unedited version of who we are when the world goes quiet. That kind of honesty, that kind of surrender, it's terrifying and holy. And let's be real, the world will never give you permission to be still. Stillness doesn't trend, silence doesn't sell. Hustle culture is a machine that tells you you're only valuable when you're producing. You're only worthy when you're visible. But God's voice doesn't scream over the noise. He waits for the stillness. He waits for you to stop performing long enough to remember who you are and whose you are. From a psychological lens, especially in trauma-informed work, we know that rest is not a reward, it's a necessity for survival. But more than that, it's a form of resistance. In a world that says, prove yourself, stillness says, I already am enough. And prayer within that stillness becomes less about requests and more about restoration. I've learned that choosing stillness is one of the most courageous things a person can do. It's the decision to pause when everything in you wants to push forward. It's saying no to chaos so you can say yes to clarity. It's choosing to root your life in something deeper than likes, followers, or applause. And I've also learned this. God does some of his most transformative work in the quiet. Not because he isn't working when we're busy, but because when we're still, we finally notice. Stillness is not weakness. It's not laziness. It's not defeat. It's strength that no one sees. It's trust without proof. It's breathing when the world is yelling. It's praying when you feel nothing and doing it anyway. These quiet moments we're so quick to avoid. They're sacred ground. They're where healing begins, where lies lose their grip, where peace returns, softly and slowly, like light through the cracks. In the stillness, we find the sacred. In the silence, we find ourselves. And in prayer, we remember we were never alone. So maybe today you don't need another solution. Maybe you just need to sit down, breathe, close your eyes, say nothing, feel everything, and